why are the top 3 most competitive specialties, plastic surgery, dermatology, neurosurgery, very highly correlated with, on Reddit, why can't American med schools be more chill? OP is an IMG, so an American going overseas for medical school training, at an Italian med school in year 4 of 6, and every time he comes to r/med school or r/residency, can't help but feel your guys' stress emanating through the computer. Med school over in Italy allows unlimited retakes, everyone is way less stressed, and it's much more similar to work hours to an American undergrad than to med school. Well, that's because in Europe, you are doing college and med school combined right after high school in 6 years, rather than 4 + 4, so that doesn't surprise me. And a reason why more people don't do what OP is doing is because getting into a residency in the US now to be able to practice in the US is gonna be much more challenging rather than just going to a US medical school. And the truth of the matter is that people are gonna be willing to put up with way more shit to become a doctor in the US because everyone wants to be a doctor in the US. Just look at compensation here versus almost any other country in the world. There's a reason why everyone wants to be a practicing physician here and people aren't rushing to someplace in Europe for that. Top comment is because cocaine daddy Halsted said all must suffer. I read this book. It's actually on the Med School Insider's recommended reading list. It's called The Anatomy of Addiction, I believe. And it covers Freud. It covers William Halsted, who is Daddy Halsted to this 3D printing noob. And he is in many ways the father of modern surgery. So he was around at the turn of the 20th century, so the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he's remembered for things like antiseptic technique, which drastically reduced post-operative infections. He, for example, introduced surgical gloves because his wife, who I believe was a nurse, was having some dermatitis from the antiseptics that they were using. So it led to the use of gloves, which actually helped to improve sterility and sterile practices. He was a proponent of gentle handling of the tissues, which reduced infection rates, helped with healing. He developed the Halsted radical mastectomy. Again, these are all things that are covered in the book. It's a really awesome read. I think my med school called it not mandatory, but like highly recommended reading before our M1, before we first started med school during that summer before. And I'm so glad I read it. It was such an engaging read. He actually first started using cocaine as a local anesthetic, right? But then he experimented with it personally, which led to his lifelong addiction. And of course, cocaine is a stimulant, so he had a lot of energy to have these very high, rigorous work standards that are less reasonable if you're not on a stimulant like cocaine. And it was during this time that modern residency programs were essentially established. So he was at Johns Hopkins, and prior to him, things were more unstructured when it came to medical training. You had these apprenticeships, these brief hospital internships. When Halsted came around, he had this structured residency system whereby trainees gradually took on more and more responsibility. Very reasonable. That's how you start from an intern, and then eventually by the time you're a PGY 5 or 6, you're doing independent surgeries all on your own under some supervision, but a lot less supervision than at the beginning. And this came with several other changes too. For example, now training was several years to ensure mastery, whereas prior to that, it was, again, much shorter, much less structured. He also emphasized not only mastering surgical skill in the operating room, but also scientific research. This idea came about that surgeons should be contributing to medical knowledge. And this is obviously starting in surgery, but also expanded to medicine as a whole. He also had this pyramidal training structure. So it was competitive, it was hierarchical, where only a small number of residents actually advanced to the final stage and became chief residents. Modern programs aren't quite as cutthroat. It's more structured and you don't have this like elimination training, but you still have this competitiveness nature that is pervasive, especially in surgical specialties. And if you're wondering why it's called residency, for physicians, by the way, you're going to see a lot of mid-levels and non-physicians trying to use the word residency to like justify that their training is just as rigorous when it's not even fucking close. It's because he required residents to literally live in the hospital to ensure the intensive and immersive training. So while current residents don't necessarily live in the hospital, they still work insane hours. And that's, again, a remnant of Halsted's influence. And some people rightly point out that why are we still doing this when this is like 100-plus-year-old practice that's a bit antiquated now, and inertia. I mean, things have been this way for a long time, therefore there's more resistance to change it. And again, because everyone wants to be a physician in the US, there's less pressure to do so. Becoming a physician in the US is the lowest risk, highest certainty way of making very good money, like mid 6 figures, $500K per year. Very structured and high probability of success outcome as long as you're able to jump through the hoops and get from college to med school to residency in your desired specialty, which is competitive and challenging, and there's some level of attrition, but compared to other specialties, a much higher degree of certainty on the other side of making a great income. Money go burr in the US, relatively speaking. The older you get, the more you realize that money influences a lot of things, which is why, why are the top 3 most competitive specialties, plastic surgery, dermatology, neurosurgery, all very highly correlated with being some of the highest compensated specialties? And then again, going back to the prior point, why is it that we're able to mistreat our future physicians? It's because they're willing to put up with so much, since so many people want to become doctors in the US, and people from not just in the US, but also from overseas want to come here and practice. Oh man, this comment was removed by a moderator, but I like the response. Something about what it does to separate you from a mid-level. You probably don't understand why that's important now, but you will. It warms my heart when we are getting back to the truth and we're not focusing on saying that, hey, we're all equal, kumbaya. We can be all equal as humans, but in terms of our level of training and expertise, no. As a physician, you are far better trained, have far more knowledge than someone like an NP or a PA, which are the mid-levels, which even that term mid-level, they tried to make offensive because it highlights the fact that they have a middle level of training greater than that of someone like a nurse, but less than that of a physician, but they found that offensive because they want to confuse you and make you think that they are the same as physicians when they are nowhere near as well trained as physicians. But that's something I've covered in other videos. If you think this sub represents actual med school experience in the US, half these fuckers probably have BPD, borderline personality disorder. My experience has been pretty delightful overall. In response to that, I'd go on SDN and read about, which is Student Doctor Network, I'd read about how terrible surgery rotations were, but mine wasn't. And then I would read about how horrible surgery residency was, but mine wasn't. This person is having a great experience. You have to be careful of this, and this is something that we've alluded to and many others have as well over the years, which is that when you go to these online communities, it can be an echo chamber. And who is going to be most active, most likely to complain? It's of course going to be, just like with ratings, people that had really negative experiences and people who had very positive experiences, and you lose out a little bit in the middle. So keep that in mind. SDN, from what we've seen, tends to have a higher average level of neurosis and a lot of like anxiety and also just a lot of bad advice because you have the blind leading the blind. It's oftentimes pre-meds giving other pre-meds advice based on what they heard from other pre-meds. So the quality of advice there can be mixed. And sometimes you do have people who are further along in training, which usually means they're providing better advice. But even then, you know, some people are going to have more admissions experience, some less. Some people may have admissions experience, but not understand that their program is different from some other programs and how varied and how wide-ranging some of these situations are. I've said this in many videos in the past. I enjoyed my med school years much more than my college years, and people think that I'm weird for that, but I think there's several people out there who enjoy the rigor, the subject matter, the intensity of med school over college. And also in college, you're focusing more on other things beyond just academics. You have to focus more on extracurriculars as an example, whereas in med school, you can focus on med school plus some research on the side, plus whatever things you really care about. It's like you narrow down and you focus on greater depth and fewer things rather than a wider breadth. I thought med school would be horrific looking at this sub, but honestly, not that bad. I study or work less than almost all of my friends in normal 9-to-5 jobs. This place kind of filters for people coming to complain or have other mental hurdles they're struggling with. Okay, so to add some context here, the amount you need to study will vary based on your goals in medical school. I have a buddy, very close buddy, who has such a unique and balanced and lovely approach to life. He never studied more than like 8 hours a day. He never really felt the need to push it to redline in med school. He always prioritized work-life balance because he said, hey, life is now, like there were certain things that I very much respected about that. But his long-term goals were also aligned with that. He said, you know what? I don't have to do derm or plastics or neurosurgery. I'm fine doing family medicine. And there's also a whole nother conversation there about like, well, you know, if you also don't have any college or med school loans, then you also feel less pressure in certain things. And that's fine. There are some students like that. But if I took his approach, there is no fucking chance in hell that I would have mashed into plastic surgery. And I would extend that to say anyone who would take that approach to medical school would be incredibly unlikely to match into derm, plastics, neurosurgery, ENT, orthopedic surgery, urology. It depends on what your end goal is. And there's no right or wrong. Just be intentional about that and understand that if you're going for something like family medicine, pediatrics, you can afford to have a more balanced approach, like this commenter here, who is working less than those in 9-to-5 jobs, which is definitely not the norm. But if you want to go for things that are way more competitive, again, opposite ends of the spectrum, family medicine and pediatrics being at the lower end, these other ones being at the higher end, then no, you cannot do that and successfully match into programs in those fields. Preclinical starts to drag after a while, to be honest. Hopefully M3 shakes things up, even if it's harder on my schedule. Dude, I love preclinical because what I realized is that I love control of my time. And you got a few hours of mandatory class or small group per week, and then the rest of it is like you're studying or doing whatever you want. I was able to hit the gym 5 days a week. I was able to cycle to and from class because I was also living close to the med school, whereas the hospitals I would have to drive during my 3rd and 4th years. And I was able to hang out with my friends and just like study and like go late nights into the anatomy lab, play some hip hop and have a good time studying with buddies. Feel for Italian docs who could make as much waiting tables or driving Uber. All right. Okay. The average annual salary for a physician in Italy, according to ChatGPT, is about 145,000 euros. That sounds like it's going to be a lot more than waiting tables or driving Uber. If you're talking about residency, like it's just not an honest assessment to talk about your training year salary versus how much you make as a fully trained physician, because obviously decades of your career are going to be a fully trained physician and only a fraction of that is going to be spent as a resident. But yeah, like I was saying earlier, you make way more in the US, which is why so many people want to come to the US to practice. You're not going to feel for us if you try to come back and get anything other than an internal medicine residency or family medicine or pediatrics. We're not stressed because it's fun. We're stressed because people want the jobs with the most pay, most prestige, and most fun. I'm not even the most competitive one. I'm probably more akin to you than the type A gunzos. And yeah, it looks like OP is fine with the family medicine route, which is why he chose going IMG. But yeah, this PM&R bro is spot on. Like a lot of us that go into medicine, myself included, very type A, very competitive, very much want to push our limits and see what we're capable of. And a lot of the time that stress and pressure is self-imposed. I think that makes it way more bearable because you're the one who's ultimately at the root of it and you can decide how much you want to push and how much you're okay letting off the gas versus if it was something external that you did not feel like you had control over. But to the pre-meds who are considering going IMG route, like OP is saying that they went IMG because they're okay with family medicine. Keep in mind, it's like 70+% of students from their first year of med school to their 4th year of med school, so like from the beginning to the end of med school, they change their mind about what specialty they want to go into. So I thought I was going to be a pediatric gastroenterologist because I have inflammatory bowel disease. It's like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease had a sick baby. That's what I have. And I wanted to help kids that had the same condition. And it was so meaningful to me. And I did research in IBD during college. And I was so moved by, it was so tough for me as an 18-year-old. How hard must it be for the children who have the same condition, right? And then between my 1st and 2nd year of med school, I found out that peds GI, definitely not for me. I talk much more about that in the Why I Didn't GI video. And then I was kind of aimless for a year or two until I found out about plastic surgery and I said, wow, this shit is cool, especially the complex reconstructions. The aesthetics has never really appealed to me that much, honestly. So again, for that reason, to keep your options open, because if I went to Italy or the Caribbean or wherever else, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna be a GI doctor, and then I'm like, wait, JK, I wanna be a plastic surgeon, and I would be totally hosed, and it would be way more difficult by an order of magnitude, almost impossible for me to then match without doing several years of research and having some really excellent connections. The few times you do see an IMG or FMG match into one of these very competitive specialties, it's either one, they did several years of research, which also it's no guarantee. I've actually known people that did the several years of research and then had to go back to Europe because they couldn't match still. Or number 2, they had connections. You can actually build those connections, but it's a lot easier said than done. Usually, from what we've seen, it's actually connections that they have through family or other things that are not as readily done by others. So just keep that in mind. When you see the IMG route, oh, I can go to the Caribbean or wherever else, and it's so much easier. I don't have to worry about this whole application process here in the US for either a BSMD or go to college and then do the regular MD route, right? There's different ways to get your MD. It's way, way easier on the front end by orders of magnitude, but it is way harder on the back end when you're actually trying to get into residency. So for most people, but not all, it's gonna be a bad trade-off to make it easier now and much harder then. So for most students, you want to focus on USMD, keep all your options open. That's the top tier route. Second tier would be USDO, the osteopathic route, which is not gonna have as many doors open as USMD, but it is a little bit more attainable, a bit easier to get in, and keeps most of your options open. And then only after that would you consider international, and still you should be applying to USMD and USDO at least a few times. And ideally not just resubmitting your application each year, but actually working to improve that year to year. And we do help with reapplicants at Med School Insiders. Only then should you be considering going international. Unlimited retakes sounds great for stress, but they could come at the cost of quality. In medicine, there's no do-overs with patients, and you can't hit the retake button if you mess up. So that's why the training is so intense. It's supposed to prepare us for those high stakes moments. That being said, US med schools could definitely chill a bit. We can still train competent doctors without running them into the ground. Maybe find a balance between you fail, you're done, and unlimited retries, you know? Well, most US schools don't say you fail once you're done. You actually are able to retake certain blocks, and if you fail a certain number of blocks, then you have to retake the whole year. And then if you fail that year again, then you're gonna be kicked out. I think the biggest issue is actually in residency more so than med school, and it comes down to using residents as cheap labor rather than physicians that need to be trained to the best of their ability, such that by the time they graduate, they're excellent, amazing, well-trained physicians that are not wasting time doing scut work and other nonsense in residency just because they're cheap labor. Isn't the salary of most docs in Europe borderline insulting? If it's chill, then it makes more sense. Exactly. OP says 50,000 to 80,000 in Italy, but average wage is only around $25,000. Not aligned with what ChatGPT said, but ChatGPT isn't always correct. That still seems incredibly low. But again, if it's super low, then you can't have a terrible training process, because if you have low compensation at the end and a terrible high friction training process, then no one's going to want to do it. So as this person is saying, not surprising that if you're making a lot less money, it's going to be more chill. Maybe it's just my school, but I feel like med school is fairly chill. It's a lot of work and a long process, but most things are pass fail. There are hella resources for learning, and you're given a lot of grace. Plenty of people remediate exams and are given lots of chances. Then even if they fail, they'll just have to repeat a block, a year, or start all over again. It's hard to get in, but once you're in, it's pretty hard to fail out, in my opinion. I wouldn't say it's hard to fail out, it's just very low likelihood, because med schools are pretty effective at selecting students who are not gonna fail out, which is why the attrition rate is so low once you become a medical student. And yeah, like I was alluding to, it's not just like one fail and you're done. There are many chances. But again, a lot of this is self-imposed, as this LAX doc is alluding to. If you want it to be chill, you can make it pretty chill, but you also need to be okay with what that entails in terms of, yeah, you're not gonna go into some of these more desirable specialties. I say desirable in quotes because how competitive a specialty is in part a function of how desirable it is to the larger med student population, but also things like supply and demand. Like certain specialties just have very few seats. This actually reminds me of Dr. Pandy, who has been on the channel a few times, and he was my study buddy in med school, right? So first 2 years we were like studying together most days, and it was funny at the end of med school, he was like, yeah, you know, looking back, man, we studied way too hard. We overdid the level of commitment. And I was like, huh, interesting. I actually felt like it was just the right amount. And it was only later that I realized, because he went into internal medicine, he's a hospitalist, the amount of effort he was putting in was not necessary for his ultimate outcome. He crushed it. He went to a great IM residency program, and he's an amazing doctor. And he said, well, I could have still gotten here with a little bit less effort and a little bit more balance. Whereas for me, I thought, well, based on where I wanted to go and based on what my goals were, I thought that I studied the right amount. So again, there's no right or wrong. Is he wrong for saying that he could have gone a bit easier and had more balance? No, I actually agree that he could have taken it a bit easier and gotten to the same exact endpoint. Whereas for me, or for some of my classmates who went into other specialties which do demand more from you, then no, that approach would not have worked. As with most things in life, the answer is money. Becoming a doctor in the States offers substantial financial incentives, and where there is financial incentive, there will never be a shortage of competition. It's simply supply and demand. The specialties that are compensated the best can afford to only take the best applicants, and the result is a culture of stressing yourself to the max to achieve the highest possible income and prestige. How do we change American med school to be more chill? Cap physician pay under 6 figures. As soon as no one wants to do med school anymore, it will be super chill. I'm surprised this is so far down. This comment should be higher up. This is exactly what I've been saying earlier in the video. Another one. Physicians here can easily make 400K and it's competitive. That's why it's more stressful. Yep. Just to round this out, remember that your experience of med school is largely individual to you, and part of that is undeniably your strengths, your interests, where you derive energy from, what drains you, but it's also what goals you have and how hard you want to push yourself to achieve those goals, depending on how much they demand of you. And as I talk to more and more med students and residents and attending physicians, it's clear that there is a huge spread, a huge range of level of enjoyment and perception of the medical training process. I was just catching up with a buddy, a fellow car enthusiast, shout out to the Jabal and Cars YouTube channel, who I met through there, and he's now a PGY1. He's an intern in family medicine in Southern California. And he went to a DO school also in California, and he's loving life. He wants to open up a DPC, that's a direct patient care. It's not quite concierge medicine, but we'll cover that in more detail on the Med School Insider channel. And he's approached med school as well as residency in a balanced way. He's able to enjoy his hobbies like cars and going to the racetrack and such, which is, how I met him, and is not slaving away and sacrificing 7 years of his life to become a physician. So there's no right or wrong. There's a spectrum here, and it depends on where you choose to be on that spectrum. That is what will determine your experience in med school and a residency. But tell me, where did I get things wrong?